It's really great to see many of you here. I need to figure out how to do this. I think I saw many of you in this session before, so I have to thank you. You're gluttons for punishment. Thank you for being here again. My name is Jeff Ball, and I'm a scholar in residence at a think tank at Stanford University in California that deals with energy at the law and business schools at Stanford, called the Steyer-Taylor Center for Energy Policy and Finance. And my background is as a journalist. I was a journalist covering energy and the environment at the Wall Street Journal for about 14 years before moving to Stanford about a year ago. This is my first visit to Morocco. I'm very happy to be here. Really glad you're interested in the subject. And what I want to do, I want to introduce our panel, and I hope you'll agree with me that we're very lucky to hear from these guys. Representing a varied geography, lots of experience and different perspectives in the renewable energy industry and in renewable energy policy making. Let me quickly introduce them, and let me tell you then logistically how we'll handle the time together. And what I want to jump to is that this is not just going to be us talking to you, but we're going to have an interactive discussion. So what I very much hope is that what these folks say up here will make you excited or angry or disappointed, and will make you want to stand up and make a comment or ask a question, and we're going to leave time for that at the end. If at the end you haven't been interested in anything that they say and there are no hands, I'll regard that as an absolute failure on our part, so please don't let that happen. Let me just first quickly introduce our panelists here. First, we have Jacques Jamart, Senior Vice President for New Energies at Alstom Power. We have Oliver Steinmetz, who is co-founder and a board member of the DESERTEC Foundation, and Oliver will tell you a bit more about what that is. We have Hugues Ravenel, who's director of Pleu, which, and again, Hugues will tell you more about that, but a plan dealing with energy in the Mediterranean region. We have Mike Coombs, CFO, Chief Financial Officer for NurEnergie, and again, I'm going to leave it to these folks to tell you more about the relevance of their titles. And we have Robert Lorentz, who's a policy officer for renewable energy at the European Commission. So I think you'll agree we've got a varied perspective here. And let me just tell you a little logistically about how we're going to do this. We've got about 90 minutes, perhaps a little bit more. We'll have a discussion up here, and then, as I said, I'm going to leave time for participation for everyone here because I've got an idea of things that we want to talk about, but I'm sure that I'll be forgetting things, so hopefully you'll jump in. We are going to be very informal here. There are going to be no PowerPoint presentations. There are going to be no long speeches, and I'm going to be very rude. And I'm going to interject and tell people to stop talking if they keep talking and we feel like we've heard it before. The goal here is not to have you listen to talking points. The goal is to really have a discussion and have you feel like you've left this room hearing something beyond what you can read on the internet. And I think these guys are going to deliver. I've asked them, I've not given them any kind of list of questions. We all just met briefly and had a bit of a chance to discuss. But the one thing that I did do is ask them by way of introduction to answer one question, just to spend a couple of minutes answering it. The question is, what do you see as the single biggest problem with the way the world has been pursuing renewable energy, and how would you fix it? Now, before I give them the chance to answer, let me just take a minute or two and frame this. It seems to me that we're at a bit of a crossroads, to use a cliche, with renewable energy. There is extraordinary interest in renewable energy technologies around the world. You heard, those of you in this session before, the International Energy Agency just came out with a report earlier this week which said two things that I think said a lot of things, but I think two things are important to keep in mind in the context of this discussion. One is that currently the world gets 81% of its energy from fossil fuels. And in 2035, the IEA said the world will get 75% of its energy from fossil fuels. So you can interpret that number however you'd like to. That's a 6 percentage point drop, which in the context of a global energy industry is not insignificant. Nevertheless, it's only a 6 percentage point drop. And so the prediction is that fossil fuels will remain overwhelmingly dominant decades down the road, just as they are today. Another thing that the IEA said, however, is that renewable energy will represent quite a large proportion of total electricity generation, and that in just I think it was a third of total electricity generation in 2035 from renewable energy. And in a matter of 5 years from now, renewable energy will become the second largest source of electricity, again, not energy, but electricity generation behind coal. That's extraordinary, right? Renewable energy will be number 2 to coal in terms of electricity production. So what does that tell you? One thing, it seems to me, tells you 2 things that I think we should keep in mind. One is, again, fossil fuels are going to dominate, at least according to the IEA's predictions. But it also tells you, if you think about the pie of the global energy system, and if you think that fossil fuels have the biggest slice of that pie, the renewable energy slice is going to get larger. And even if it's a small slice of that pie, given how big that pie is, that's a huge economic opportunity for companies and for countries. And it's a good, some people are going to make a lot of money, and some people are going to and have been losing a lot of money. We'll get into that discussion. I'm going to shut up now and let these gentlemen address the question. And again, the question that I asked them to open up with, just for about 3 minutes apiece, was what do you see as the single biggest problem with the way the world has been pursuing renewable energy, and how would you fix it? Please. Sorry? Oh, I think you're right there. Just press the little red button.
Hello?
The red
okay.
button. There you go.
Thanks. Thanks, Jeff. Well, it's a bit of a pity to start talking about problems instead of successes, but it's a bit the name of the story.
We'll get to the successes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I would say new energies and renewable energy is something we have to admit the fact that it's brand new energy. And because we have to develop those energy, it costs money, and it's more costly at the beginning as the fossil or nuclear energies in terms of price per kilowatt hour. It means that it needs to be supported, subventioned by government, by banks, and by industry. And for me, the biggest problem we've had so far is the fact that there was no consensus, no coherence between the action of the various governments. And even when the government has taken some action, sometimes it withdraw the action. If I take the example in Europe with the PV, there was a lot of incentive to develop PV, and all of a sudden they decided to stop subventioning, and then there were...
I'm going to interrupt because I'm going to do this throughout. I'm just going to define terms here, so just so that we don't assume knowledge. PV is photovoltaic, which refers basically to the predominant technology, at least in part of the world, in solar panels that convert sunlight to electricity. Excuse me.
We're so much involved in our businesses that we use acronym too easily. Then for me, the biggest problem is that lack of coherence. One factor that favored that lack of coherence is the fact that renewable energy is based on natural resources, and every country has different natural resources. Here in Morocco, to develop solar solution looks coherent because you have lots of sun. You have something in the range of 3,000 hours of sun per year. If you're in Scotland, you start looking at other solutions because you have little chances to be successful with a solar solution. Then, in fact, for me, this is the biggest problem. It's lack of coherence, lack of consistencies, and for sure, when you start when you enter a new era, a new business like the renewable energy, you need to make long-lasting effort. It's not a 1 or 2 years effort, it's 10, 15 years, 20 years effort. And if you compare, if you remember a few years ago, they launched the TV screen, flat screen, LCD. The first time I saw the price of one, I said, who's going to be these silly assholes buying one of these? It's so expensive. Today, everybody's got one. It took 10 years, 15 years, but we are there today. And I think to a certain extent, and certainly, renewable energy is in that logic. That's why I think for me the solution to fix it is not to try to force people to go only in one route, is to try, actually, and I'm talking as an industrial, is try to provide an adapted solution to every type of environment, for a solution for every natural resources, and try to help the local authorities, the governments, and together with the banks and so forth, to find the best adapted solution. But for sure, we need stability. at the government level. We need stability at subvention level, because for the next 10, 15 years, it will not survive without a minimum subventions.
So one concern here is constancy of government support and certainty of government support going forward, expressed by our first speaker. Excellent. Thank you, Oliver. And thank you for respecting the time limit so far. We're moving right along. Oliver, please. Thanks.
So my response about what's the single biggest issue or challenge currently in renewables comes, of course, from this less industrial background, but from the more citizen background and NGO background, because we are basically, DESERTEC Foundation was founded by 25 people like me with our own money, and we said we have to do something. So now we are more observers and communication platform for the renewables sector, because we are based on scientific studies that said, in the end, that developed the concept, the DESERTEC concept, which says use renewable energies wherever they are the most abundant and therefore the most economical to use, of course. And that would obviously mean the biggest of them all is solar, by far, the biggest resource. And of course, the idea is to not, let's say, do a lot of incentive schemes to put solar energy into Central Europe, but put it in the deserts, because that's where there is the most sun to be harvested. So, and of course, in that sense, I can only congratulate Morocco for their solar plan, because that's really the best example now where a country has understood where its resources are and what the really best resources are that it has. Now, the problem there, and in Morocco as well, as in all the other countries, is currently, I think, not the technology anymore, because of course the technology is moving, there are lots of progress being made, especially in solar thermal, but to finance it. So I keep saying, who pays the delta? Because so far there is the standard price for 1 kilowatt hour, and then there is the price when you produce it from concentrating solar power, which will be, for example, done in Ouarzazate here in Morocco in the next years in a very nice way. But then somebody has to pay the additional price, because it's still more expensive. Even in Morocco, it's still more expensive, in spite of all the good sun and all that. So there we have to really work on that. And in the meantime, we simply can identify a lot of projects that I call the cherry-picking projects, la cerise sur le gâteau, the small cases where, case by case, there is already a good business case for one particular power plant in one particular place in one particular application. Little examples could be an aluminum plant or a steel plant that happens to be next to a desert. Why don't they get their electricity themselves with a solar power plant right next to them? Or a tourism installation, for example. They need a lot of energy these days, but they want to be clean. Tourism wants to be green tourism these days. So that might be a very good way to say, hey, we're doing this in a new way. So I always draw the analogy between Morocco and Jordan, for example. Both have young kings, by the way. But I was recently in Jordan and told them, well, look in Morocco. They also have a young king, and the king wants it. And that's why, well, it's beginning to work. It's beginning to pick up. And in Jordan, they're still thinking, debating. They're not so sure yet, but they have the same problem as Morocco. They have to import 95% of their energy. And so they have to get rid of that dependency. And on top of that, it's the water situation, which the DESERTEC concept has included in the whole concept, because we also have to provide people with drinking water. So we need a lot more water desalination than we have today. And that's going to be also requiring a lot of electricity. Last point I wanted to say is, let's not forget energy efficiency. We're always thinking as if and talking as if it's a God-given fact that electricity consumption will rise by 8% per year. Sorry, it's not. We can save so much energy by just better insulating our houses, or by more intelligently using energy in every place on Earth, that there is so much potential and so much industrial potential and economic potential in energy efficiency that we shouldn't leave that out. So it has to be the combination of all these efforts, but with the goal to go to the post-fossil era, as I call it. It's not just the post-petrol and post-gas era, it's the post-fossil, including nuclear. So for those who say, well, there is a certain country in Europe that says, we have completely décarbonisé, les technologies décarbonisées. Yes, well, that sounds almost green, but it's actually what they mean is nuclear. So, I mean, that's not the solution as far as we can see, at least not in the long term. Of course, we have the bridging needs, but okay, so that's enough polemics for now, so I'll stop here.
Excellent, and I dare say that I predict that there might be some discussion about that point in the questions afterward. Hugues, please, thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. To begin with, just a few words about Plan Bleu, as you requested. So Plan Bleu is a kind of interface between science and decision at the Mediterranean level in the field of environment and sustainable development. And we try to make available for decision maker the results of science in the Mediterranean basins. It's a very difficult task because you have many disciplines, many articles, and you have to synthesize this for decision maker to be able to use it in their work. And it's a two-way process. Of course, also when we face issues in implementing sustainable development policies, then Plan Bleu is responsible for translating those issues into research problematics that can be tackled by scientists. Mediterranean Basin is a kind of laboratory for sustainable development and for clean energy, because the country around the Mediterranean Sea are very diverse in terms of socioeconomic status, and we have also in terms of energy resources diverse situations. Of course, we have Algeria, which is a big producer, whereas others should import their resources. To come to your question, I think that we have to think outside of the energy box. And in fact, for the time being, we are looking at the offer, renewable, nuclear, coals, shale gas. It's a heavy debate now in France. And perhaps we have to change our glasses and to look things from the users, from the usage. And that's why on Plan Bleu side, we push for energy demand management, also water demand management. It could be declined for many resources. And I wish to insist on the fact that the way renewable energy were pushed by public policy, especially in Europe, were in a way a little bit contradictory with this energy demand management, because it could give the impression that we will solve the problem by new technology, whereas it's really a change of culture, a change of paradigm in which the consumer should be enabled to take part to the decisions. And surprisingly enough, I preferred the conclusion by Alstom representatives insisting on adapted solution to local solution. I preferred this conclusion as your conclusion because your conclusion were, I mean, it was not your conclusion, it was your introduction about a global view. Of course, it's important to give the perspective of a post-fossil area, and I agree on that. But we have also to really tackle local situation which could be very different one from another. You could use energy from the sea, from biomass, and we have to build systems that would be resilient. That means that that are more local. That's my first words. I'm not sure I kept in the slot. May I? Okay. Okay.
That was good, and one of the objectives here is to give us food for thought, and we've got lots of food for thought developing here, so we'll dig in. Mike, please, what concerns you most?
Okay. My answer will be very much focused on the perspective of the investor and the developer. Without the...
Mike, can you just explain what NurEnergie is at some point, just so people know?
Sorry, yes. So I'm CFO for a company called NurEnergie, which is a pure developer. It's a small team of 8 people. A lot of us have put money into the business. And we are focused very much on developing a utility scale development projects where the resource is strong, so not in marginal locations. For example, as Jacques mentioned, sun in Scotland, but sun in the desert. But the other key thing here, which I don't think we've mentioned yet, is that the first phase of renewable development has very much been local. It's been about developing out in the UK, for example. If you look at wind, which is the natural renewable energy source to develop because we have a lot of wind, it's been transmitting that to relatively small or relatively close locations. The problem with that is that if you were to say, right, tomorrow there's no fossil fuel, there's no nuclear, we have to rely on renewable, the UK couldn't physically build enough wind farms on its available land to satisfy that. That's why we're looking at offshore. But coming back to just to answer the specific question, I think the biggest problem, and Jacques already mentioned this, is the uncertainty on the electricity tariff. There needs to be that certainty for investors to have the confidence to invest both in development and then ultimately in constructing these big contracts and then operating them. Without that, nothing happens. You cannot possibly, without that subsidy, whilst the actual cost of this technology remains high, without an adequate subsidy, these things will not be built. So you have to. So the government's role in this and the EU's role in this, I believe, is to provide an environment, an investment environment that gives investors the confidence that they can plan for the future. We're seeing that particularly that particular issue being played out in the UK at the moment with nuclear. Big discussions on that. But the other thing I would just say before we get into any more detail later is that in addition to that particular problem, the issue is you need to replace you need to start bringing in renewable technologies that have base load capacity. In other words, you need to be able to store the energy. So when the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine, you need still to be able to generate power. If you can do that, that's the holy grail. That's what we all ought to be looking for, and it needs to be done at scale. So, for example, a big CS or concentrated solar plant in the desert, for example, in Morocco or Tunisia or somewhere like that, exporting a significant amount of that to Europe, where it can get big subsidies, and obviously plenty of power for local consumption as well. That is a way of solving the long-term energy needs of certainly Europe. Because of the proximity of such a great resource with lots and lots of land. And the other final point is that the technology now means that you do not need a lot of water either to actually generate that power. They're in closed systems. So the issue of water isn't such an issue as it used to be. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Robert, please.
Thank you. I'm working in the Renewables policy unit at the European Commission. There's already been a lot of subjects touched upon. It's difficult to add or difficult also to not want to answer to some of them already. I think from a policymaker's point of view, the main message or the main issue that we need to tackle is really the stability of the framework. I was at an industry conference for concentrated solar power yesterday, and it's always the same messages at these conferences from the industry, from people that want to develop energy solutions. Is what we need is a predictable framework. We don't necessarily want huge returns on investment. We're happy to work with a rather small margin of return, but what we need is predictability, reliability of the framework. And I think being in policy making on the European level at the moment is not an easy position to be in, but it's exciting. I think the framework that we've been setting in the European Union has been very successful, has proven very successful. I don't know how many of you are aware, but there is a mandatory target for all member states to reach a certain level of renewable energy in 2020, and every member state has to introduce measures, policy measures to support this objective, and we've already come a long way. But we are starting to run into problems now. One problem is that renewable energies often have been developing in boom and bust cycles, and we need to overcome this. And another problem is that policy making has had a very national perspective for a long time, and that's been working fine for a while. But now we see there also we do run into a lot of problems. So what do we need? What could be a solution? Well, one obvious solution is we need to have more exchange of best practice, because there are examples where things are working quite well, where renewable energies have the integration of renewable energies and a high share of variable renewable energy sources has been going quite well. There's Spain, which is running into a problem now as well, but the integration of renewable energies is quite impressive. There's Denmark, there's also Germany. So there, and in number 20% of, 20 of the member states in the European Union have already surpassed their interim target and their trajectory towards 2020. So there's been a lot of success stories already, but we're at the point where we need to get more intelligent. Feed-in tariffs have played a role in the beginning, an important role. They have provided the stability to kick off development of renewable energies, and they were very important in that. But now we see that the market developments have been so fast and so quick that policy making has had a difficulty to keep in the pace with the market developments, and that the systems were not able to intelligently adapt to the market development. So we need to move our policy making towards more market elements, towards probably away from feed-in tariffs, more towards premiums, where producers actually have to act on the market and have to take some of the risk of their investment. And we need to exchange on that. And there's been a lot of you've been talking a lot about whether we need local adapted solutions, or whether we need to go for large-scale centralized energy production. And I don't think this is a contradiction at all. We need both. That's quite clear. And if I say we need to exchange best practices, it doesn't mean we need the exact same policy and the exact same policy everywhere. But we can have shared methodologies how to design a certain support framework, and maybe one more point on that as well. It's not only subsidies. The policy framework, the enabling policy framework, is a lot more than that. It's the administrative framework. It's grid access. It's a lot of issues that we need to ensure that renewable energies can actually compete on the same level with the conventional energies for whom this system has been designed in the first place. So,
excellent. Thank you. Thank you. No, that was really great. This is great. I think we've got a lot to chew on here, and we have about an hour in which to chew. I want to follow up on one thing that Robert said, and I want to ask Mike to address it. Mike was talking about the need for a strong, predictable subsidy regime to incentivize, among other things, large centralized renewables in places like Morocco to export to Europe. It seems to me that if you look around the world, just to pick up on Robert's point about the need for more intelligent policy, there's broadly speaking a retrenchment away from the kind of government support that's existed thus far. And there's quite a lot of thinking about how to smarten up policies. But I'll give you an example just to play the role of the rude guy here about inefficiencies in policies. And let's just sort of take a quick world tour. In the United States, we don't have, on any national sense, a feed-in tariff. We incentivize renewable energy with what are called tax credits, and that the difference is that the subsidy is borne by the taxpayer, not the ratepayer. But there have been interesting studies which have suggested that something like 30% of the revenue from those tax credits goes not to supporting the development of renewable energy projects, but rather goes to the profits of Wall Street, banks who are involved in providing tax equity. So not to go too far in the weeds, but the question is, this is essentially a cost of the policy, and it raises the question about whether there could be a smarter way if one's goal is to proliferate renewable energy. In Europe, I think it's fair to say that from Spain to Italy to Germany, there's been a public kind of, certainly in Spain and Italy, a backlash against the very juicy credits that have existed. In China, which we will discuss here, and which has become a massive renewable energy player, there are all sorts of inefficiencies in the system. I'll just name one. In Inner Mongolia, which is where the Chinese wind industry is based, something like 1/3 of the wind turbines that were built in the region under a subsidy system until very recently were unconnected to the grid, because the subsidy system incentivized the construction of the wind turbines, not the production of electricity from the wind turbines. And you got the kind of result that subsidy led to. And so none of this is news. Policymakers are very savvy about trying to figure out what to do. But I just want to, so forgive the long wind up here, but the question I want to ask Mike, and then if anyone wants to jump in, feel free, is if your sense is that there needs to be a stable and robust subsidy system to incentivize these projects, and yet on the other hand there seems to be a political retrenchment from subsidies, if you could wave your magic wand, what would you do to subsidies to make them sort of more intelligent and, in your view, economically sustainable?
Yeah, thanks. That's an interesting question. I think the ultimate goal is that obviously renewable technology will be as competitive without any subsidy to fossil fuels currently. The fact of the matter is fossil fuels are heavily subsidized, as we all know, in one way or another. But the way to make this smart is some form of a contract for difference type approach, where as the cost of these renewable technologies comes down, the tariff comes down also for new projects. So yeah, so you build a project today and at X, and there's a tariff, and you know you've got that for 20 years. And then in 5 years' time, say the cost of that particular technology has come down by 20%, then that ought to be reflected in the tariff. Now, if you do that, you have a system where not only does the investor have certainty, but the government and the consumers feel as they've got a good deal as well.
Does anyone else want to jump in? Excuse me. Anyone else want to jump in an answer to that question, Oliver?
At least from being German and having looked at the German subsidy scheme, or the inventors of the feed-in tariffs there, I can say that even if you invent the feed-in tariff and say, yes, and we will decide at any given time when necessary to reduce the subsidies, even in that case, it's like Robert said it, it's the government can't even catch up, keep the pace of the creativity of the entrepreneur. I mean, I don't want to sound terribly neoliberalist here, but at least it's actually amazing what creativity in the renewable energies has taken place in the last years, and it's obviously still going on. So having this incentive scheme is good, but then we have to sort of, as the policymakers, and the only real policymaker here is, I guess, sitting on our left. So we all have to look at him, basically. As soon as we talk about government, we have to look on the left. Because then you have to basically set expectations right, in the sense of, well, yes, this is what the first movers will get, and they will get a good incentive, But then if you're in the part of the second movers, you see that in the Andesol solar plant in Spain, for example, Andesol 1 was not bankable. Nobody wanted to finance it. And then slowly but surely they convinced the EIB and others. But Andesol 2 was already in a general mood where some people had realized, hey, there is some profit to be made here. This is actually a money-making machine. And Andesol 3 was completely, bought by investors. Well, in that sense, for investment purposes. It wasn't even, nobody cared anymore whether this was good for the planet or good for the environment or anything. It's just good money-making. So then we have to make it not too good, of course. So there has to be a good reaction to shave down the subsidies, yet be stable and predictable.
So,
another way to be clever would be to tax fossil fuels so that the price is the same as renewable. In that sense, especially we need public resources. It would be the most clever way to act because it will have less drawbacks.
Yeah, well, right. Let me just very quickly. Does any of you see the prospect of taxing fossil fuels? I mean, it seems to me, look, this was mentioned in the earlier panel. There is a price on carbon somewhere in the world, right? It exists in Europe, and look what's happened to the price of carbon. The price of carbon is about €1.50 or so, right? And Carmen Becquerel mentioned this, where it had been at 11. So that doesn't seem to be a terribly compelling price signal for people to change what they're doing. And in the United States, there's been a lot of discussion about the possibility of some sort of a price on carbon, and newly elected President Obama made a statement the other day in which he essentially said that the United States isn't going to do anything on carbon that is going to sacrifice jobs. So if anyone feels the need to jump in, does anyone see the likelihood of a much more aggressive price on carbon anywhere in the world, regardless of what structure that takes, than exists in the world now?
Well, I'll just jump in quickly. In terms of the UK, I can talk a little bit about the UK. The UK has issued or the UK government has issued a white paper on its energy, on the future of energy in the UK. And what that looks at is it recognises that there's going to be a mix of energy production solution facilities. And what it does is it introduces a carbon tax to if you like, deter investment in dirty fossil fuels, and it sees those and accelerate the closing of those. But also it's introducing this contract for differences, which obviously helps the nuclear industry enormously. And the third aspect is a standby gas-fired capacity, which you need in order to solve the intermittency problem that green renewables, excluding nuclear, pose. So I think it's a mix of policy that sort of gets you there. But I think without that carbon tax, you're not going to. There isn't going to be a sufficient incentive, apart from obviously the renewable targets that have been set, which obviously utilities and governments will be fined if they don't meet. But I think you need a bit of a bigger stick as well.
I want to shift for a moment, and I want to talk about China. As will surprise a few of you here, in the last 5 years, and many of the people here have lived this massive change in their business lives. China has gone from negligible in the global renewable energy market, both as a supplier of the equipment and as a user of the energy, gone from not a player to the dominant player. Now, the world's two of the world's largest wind turbine manufacturing companies are Chinese, and they're both increasingly active internationally, including in Europe and the United States. The world's largest solar panel producer is based in China. There are now essentially trade wars going on both between the European Union and China and between the United States and China over solar panels and over wind turbines. The conflict being the extent of Chinese subsidies for renewable energy and whether Chinese subsidies are fair or whether European or United States subsidies are fair. And so the question I just want to ask is, what does China's increasing involvement in the renewable energy industry do for or to the businesses or the kind of outlooks for these gentlemen here? And I want to start here with Alstom, which has some experience in this matter.
Okay, thanks. By the way, I would like to add that the two bigger player in the hydro business are also Chinese.
In the which business?
In hydro business.
In the hardware business. In the hydro business.
At least in terms of size of factories and so forth. Well, one thing to be said is that, globally speaking, China represents more or less 50% of the worldwide needs in energy, whatever energy you would like to look at. And over the last few years, they have really focused very seriously on the renewable energies. It's clear then that they are, I would say, a very serious player. In Europe, America, we have thought first that they were a very serious customer. I mean, because the market is big and they didn't necessarily have the technology a few years ago, we have all rushed over there, installing factories and teaming up with them, transferring technology. And, well, we have some experience, whereas we didn't even finish installing the factories in China, that your partner was already competing against you in another country with your own drawings. And this is something we are facing today. And they are, well, I would say personally, my feeling is that China is in a kind of economical war. And we have difficulties to recognize that this is a war, that we always try to team up, we always try to find compromise. But I think we are too much in a compromise situation, and they are too much in an aggressive war approach. To a certain extent, they have, for whatever energy they have decided to enter in, they have built up capacities, industrial capacities that were large enough to cover 100% of their needs and even more. Meaning that as soon as you transfer your technology, whether it's in the renewable, we have some experience in transport, as soon as you transfer, they grab they pick your expertise, and they just build it up huge facilities that you cannot. They have very low price. They have a quality. Okay, we can always say that the quality is not as good as. Well, that's clear, but lots of countries just buy that low quality because it's very low price as well. And on top of it, they have lots of money. They can also finance and play the banker roles. I mean, they can finance wherever they want. They can come and trade off in lots of countries, including Africa, trade off I would say, their needs of raw material that they pick from the countries against installation that they finance and install at very low price. It's a question of trade-off. Long term, this is very dangerous because it's a question of hegemony, and you ended up while having a Chinese and a Chinese as a solution. It's clear that nowadays they have some economical difficulties. Well, they just grow 7-8% instead of 11-12. I mean, for them, it's a bit difficult. Some of their factories are not fully loaded. It means that for whoever is not in China, it's awfully difficult to enter in China and sell in China. This means it's very difficult to enter in 50% of the worldwide needs. And on the other hand, because they have overcapacity, they can export it quite easily. And you see the Chinese everywhere. And they grow very quickly. In the transport business, they were not there 5-6 years ago. All of a sudden, they're number one with the larger capacity in high-speed train production, for example. They are very huge and big in the hydro business. They are very huge and big in the wind business. They are very huge and big in the photovoltaic. Up to the point where it forced the European economies to stop financing the photovoltaic, and then it kills also some of the work that we had in Europe. It's a real threat.
Let me just ask you one thing by way of follow-up. What is Alstom's own corporate strategy in China now? Are you still in China? Are you in China to the extent that you were before, given everything that you've just said, particularly in the renewable energy business?
No, we are still in China. We have quite a large installed basis in China, some being historical, like hydro. We are there for over 15 to 20 years. We have developed the business a long time ago over there. It's harder and harder to grab order within China. We are more and more forced to use that facility, trying to mix our quality approach together with the low price of China to ourselves. We export in other countries, mainly around China, in Vietnam, Cambodia, for example, some of those products. That's difficult to resist also whenever you have a segment in which you are not yet, and the Chinese are not yet well organized. It's always difficult when they call you and say, why don't you sell? It's always difficult to resist. Although you know that it can really long-term create you problem because they come back. It's always difficult to prevent yourself from trying to make short-term business. This is a bit the name of the game. We shoot ourselves in the foot to a certain extent, but we know it and we can prevent us doing so. But mainly we try to defend our position over there, and it's tougher every day. In some places, we have tried to really develop the business with good success, and in other places with less success.
Thank you. I want to switch subjects again, does anyone else want to jump on the question of China? Please, Robert.
Briefly like to add, especially as give a little bit of a slightly different perspective, especially as regards to recent developments in PV. I think it's very good and important that we have a global legal framework to ensure fair trade, and that whenever there are unfair practices, and there is a complaint that people that whose job it is to do this, investigate, and measures are taken. But we should be very careful to not let these issues to take our entire attention actually, and to not get too excited about it, because it's not going to solve any of the problems. I think, and I do believe, contrary to what's just been said, that there is a need for cooperation, and especially if we look at the PV market, there is a huge overcapacity. Also, I mean, companies in China are running into big problems as well at the moment, and there is room for cooperation to actually develop the markets to soak up this or part of this capacity. And also, we need, as European industry or Western industry in the US, it's the same. Look at our strength. I mean, only a small portion of the added value in the PV industry actually comes from the production of panels or silicon. A very small proportion. What can we do? What is the value added from the European industry? It's production lines. It's good services and management. It's many other things as well. So, and I mean, what we wanted to achieve is for costs to come down, and that we have achieved. Partly with the German-Italian feed-in tariffs, true, but it's exactly the goal we wanted, the objective we wanted to achieve. So it's in the end, it's also a good thing.
Let me just follow up on that. It seems to me that what's behind this discussion is a kind of existential question about the industrial future of various nations. And I see it in the United States, and talking to people in Europe, I see it in Europe, and it's clearly, I see it in China, where countries are trying to answer precisely the question that Robert has just asked, which is how do we, whether we are China or Germany or Spain or Italy or Morocco or the United States, play to our strengths in a renewable energy industry that we all agree is becoming a legitimate industry, is becoming a global industry, is growing up. And my sense is that people are really struggling with this question, and it's not at all clear to most people what those strengths are. And so I guess I just ask anyone on here who wants to answer it. If you had a whiteboard and you were sketching out a map of the world in which each country played to its strengths in a globalizing renewable energy market, what would that map look like? Oliver.
Sort of plays into my hands because it's I was a bit I felt the urgency more and more here to say something about where we are here, because we're not in China, we're in Africa. So we can learn something about how China does it and so on, but let's say here we have a lot of people from Morocco, and what I'd like to stress is that what we should look for is the positive effects on the Moroccan society and economy, on the, let's say, how can this be a proposal for developing wealth for a society like Morocco? And that's where I think the distribution of roles should be, to me, I mean, there is no other way forward for Europe and the US, for example, than to stay at the top of innovation. And simply, to me, the only role how they can play a role still is relentless innovation. While the manufacturing is already taken away more and more from Europe and from the US, and it's moved to a lot more places in the meantime. So the point here is that we have to see what can be, let's say, if China does all the manufacturing, for example, what can Morocco do, what can Saudi Arabia do, what can Jordan do, and places like that. So they, I would say, have the role that they have a desert, after all. So first of all, they have a desert while others don't. China, by the way, also has a desert. Let's not forget that. Sorry, I didn't switch on the bloody telephone. Okay. Anyway, the point is that in this way, we can see how a place like Morocco can install itself as a future, even technology leader. Let's not forget that, because, I mean, Saudi Arabia, for example, made a plan now saying, well, what would be the best industry for Saudi Arabia to be in 20 years from now, to be an international leader in industry? And they found out solar industry. So there is even a competition now happening between the desert countries, because one after the other gets the hang of it and says, wait a second, this could be our market. And if Saudi Arabia does it, then next, let's say, it started with between Morocco and the Maghreb countries already. Morocco has started the solar plan. Now the Tunisians are getting worried. The Algerians are waking up. So wait a second, if there is a train leaving the station, I want to be on this train. Huh? So there is a market happening here. There's a huge market coming up. And in these renewables, there is, of course, the first mover disadvantage because they pay higher cost. So in the Moroccan Ouarzazate project, it was the concrete question of the Moroccan government to say, but we want to have X% of local content in this. We want to put this in the call for tender. A certain percentage had to be local content, and then they were told by the World Bank and the European Investment Bank, sorry guys, you can't play it like that. Not the first time. You have to let it develop in the country, and that's what will happen, because here we're talking to, by the way, a lot of African women. Let's not forget the women also, because that's this is all men sitting here, sorry. It's a typical problem. But the thing is that in the society, the role of women is still underestimated in the North African societies. I've had feedback from women from Algeria, for example, who said, well, but is this something that could finally do something for my cousins, all my cousins, all the women in Algeria, in the desert areas? They can only get married and have children, that's about it. Nothing about jobs. So, but what if this becomes the job engine? And by the way, I think there was a statistic saying there will be 100 million new jobs that have to be created in the next 20 years in the North African and MENA region. Well, where will they come from? And if they don't come, then we'll have a huge problem in the societies there. And that means not there, that means here. Yeah?
Thank you, excellent. Thanks. Hugues, please.
Yes, to stay in Africa and to answer a little bit to your question, but with a different perspective. For instance, do you know why there is no solar heated water panel industry in Egypt?
Because gas is too cheap.
Because gas is too cheap, but even subsidized and imported. And you have in Egypt, it's not very high-tech solar heated panel, but it has the job content is good. I mean, you can produce locally, you have the service locally, and it's not being developed, and the case is approximately the same in Morocco, not exactly, but we made studies on that, and that's why I argued about water demand management and local approaches, because we have worked at that. It's wonderful, but the mix, of course, I did not say that the energy demand management is contradictory with the offer approach, because you have to build industries that are competitive, it was the case in France with the nuclear, for instance. It was, a policy of offer, energy offer, and we were not such efficient in the use of this energy. We used it to heat our home, and so that's a pity. And to another point, for PV, for instance, in Europe there are now lots of houses where you have a PV panel on the roof and no solar heated panel. You will think I am obsessed by solar heated water panel, but it's if I have a background as an engineer, it's just, and even as an economist, it's just stupid. It's inefficient. We were able to heavily subsidize PV panels, whereas we continue to heat our water with